Hello, my name is Beko Pin, and you are watching Rappler. This edition of Rappler Talk will be a crash course of sorts into what will be or what already is a huge issue in the Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific in the coming weeks, in the coming years. Actually, big issue na nga siya. In turn, though, recently, it has become a huge diplomatic issue between Manila and Beijing. We have managed to oversimplify that into a question: should Filipinos care about democracy in Taiwan? The easy answer is that we should. Our guest today will help us understand why. Joining us today is Dr. Robin Garcia. He's a founder of the WR Advisory Group and president of WR Numero Research. He teaches at the UANP School of Law and Governance and is Shanghai trained. He earned his doctorate in international politics at the Fudan University, did I get that right, in Shanghai? So that alone tells you how interesting his insights today with be. He's also a Congressional Research Fellow, one of 24 experts who works closely with the Congressional Policy and Budget Research Department of the Philippines. Thank you for joining us. It's been quite a crazy week for your field of expertise. Siguro, let's start with the historic elections in Taiwan. William Lai wins the presidency, which means the ruling DPP remains in power for an unprecedented third term. What does Lai's win mean for Taiwan? What does it mean for China? And siguro, bigger picture, what does it mean for the region?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Bea, and I'm happy to be here again to talk about Taiwan. This is also an ongoing research I have at the University of Pennsylvania in the US, where I am a visiting scholar for this year. So I'm teaching classes there, and so I go to the US and also teach here. But yeah, it's really a very important topic, currently for the region. But it's also cast in the context of China's aggression, right? So I think the conversation about the democracy in Taiwan is should be cast in that backdrop of China's aggression. And the implication is quite simple. There were three candidates. One candidate is a little more lenient with China, and fortunately the person who won is the candidate who is really assertive against China, and that's William Lai Ching-te. And so international relations really is not just things that happen outside of your country, but and that the actions of the states is what you should look at. But those actions emanate from what happens in the domestic sphere. And that's why we have to care about what's happening inside Taiwan. And what we should expect from Taiwan is more pushback against China. And by extension, then the region will be less stable if China will push back against Taiwan. And I think what we have to realize is under the presidency of Xi Jinping, Taiwan is a core interest. And President Xi Jinping has repeatedly said that it will reunify Taiwan into the mainland. And the hope of China is to do that without the use of force. So if the other candidate won, and Taiwan would have ceded its sovereignty to China without the use of force. But this time, I think because the candidate is not exactly cooperative with China's interests, then you might see some form of pushback. That might lead into an actual conflict.
How does China see the president-elect of Taiwan?
Well, China is not happy, definitely. China sees the president as the new president as an enemy, as a as a traitor, right? That's at least that's the way he's being painted in mainland China.
Right.
And so it's definitely not happy, and it's gearing towards the next few years. That's a little more a Taiwan that will fight back really against China.
And I guess that also leads us to that lays the predicate of my next question. His win is historic, but domestically in the Philippines, what's making headlines is not so much his win, but how President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. reacted to the win. He sent out a tweet, a post on X, January 15 in the evening, Monday evening, congratulating Lai. It was a tweet that I guess, understatement of the year, surprised a lot of diplomats in the Philippines, not just Filipino diplomats, not just Chinese diplomats, but even like third-party observers, I think, in the diplomatic world here. Now, why is this such a big deal for Marcos to say congratulations? And he said, we look forward to close collaboration, strengthening mutual interest, fostering peace, and ensuring prosperity for our peoples in the years ahead. If this had not been Taiwan, this would sound like just a generic greeting, right? To a president, to any president-elect. But why is this such a big deal? Why is Beijing so incensed?
Well, of course, the Philippines officially adheres to the One
Yes.
China policy. So Beijing would just want to remind us that what exactly that means, right? And I think several statements from the Embassy of China here in the Philippines have really went in that direction and explained the One China policy. But the One China policy is a formal recognition of, it's a formal agreement. Actually, the U.S. also adheres formally to the One China policy, but informally also sort of has that partnership with Taiwan, because Taiwan is such an important piece in the security and stability of the Asia Pacific and in Southeast Asia and in the East Asian region, that it really the U.S. really thinks that having that sort of formal, less formal but close relationship with Taiwan is important. I think that the statement of President Marcos is also casting that light, and I think that's the right way to go, to really have some form of cooperation with Taiwan, right, moving forward. Because of so many reasons, right? One reason, of course, is because of China's aggression. Taiwan is a potential, a state that will have a big effect on Philippine security as well moving forward in the context of China's aggression, right? I'll just be very frank. If China invades Taiwan, it's not in the interest of the Philippines. Because it will then have, China will then have an easier time invading the Philippines if it decides to do so, if it successfully occupies Taiwan. Right? And so that's why. And I don't think we think about it in those terms yet. We only think about repatriation.
Yes.
We talked about this of 200,000 Filipinos, but even if you repatriate 200,000 Filipinos, the war may not be in Taiwan, it might be here in the Philippines, right? So it doesn't matter. And so I think
that's in the context of an AFP that is clearly not yet prepared for that kind of scenario.
We're not yet prepared yes, and we're definitely not yet prepared for that. I think, although I don't, you might want to confirm this, I think there were some scenario planning exercises that was done by the Defense Department, the AFP, which is good. But in the national security policy that was released recently, the Taiwan issue is not cast in security terms. So, in other words, Taiwan is not a securitized issue. It's still a social issue of OFWs coming back, being repatriated. And I think that's important, but that's an incomplete way of framing the Taiwan, the issue of Taiwan and how it affects the Philippines. So, and therefore that's why we have to care about Taiwan. It is in the Philippine interest to have some sort of cooperation with Taiwan. Just to be categorically clear. And therefore the statement of the president is something to be celebrated.
I will push back a little on that, or question that, because I think if you talk to a lot of career diplomats or diplomats from other countries, I spoke to one, and the way that they recalled seeing that tweet was they had to double check, because it was is this edited? Is this Photoshop? Why would the president of the Philippines say something like that? But maybe, and this requires maybe a little imagination, what would motivate President Marcos to be so, I don't know, would daring be the proper word to describe it? Or maybe you don't think it would be, it's daring for him to say that.
I think it's a little bit bold. Bolder, of course, compared with President Duterte.
Yes.
this is not the first time we've had some affirmative statements towards Taiwan. Although this is definitely out of the ordinary.
Yes.
And yeah, I would agree. It's a little bold.
Yeah.
But and therefore, I think I'm just thinking that
Yeah.
maybe the president and the advisors of the president have already thought about Taiwan as an important piece in
Yeah.
the security puzzle,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's the right way to go. Really.
Right. So imagine though, because I just realized as well, while the national security policy frames Taiwan with respect to our OFWs there, Marcos himself has said in I think during a visit to Japan that inevitably, like, there is no way out of the Philippines cannot not be dragged into a possible conflict in Taiwan. So it's interesting how that'll align.
Yeah,
Hopefully align in
the
coming.
president has been, and other members of this government have
Yeah.
have already recognized some sort of the importance of Taiwan, and for good reason. And I think that's the way to go. But there's still something that we don't have. We don't have a dedicated China policy. By extension, a policy towards Taiwan. So even if we have those statements, we have to really think about it systematically and rigorously.
Right.
What do we want to do with China?
Right.
If some members of government are more lenient towards China and some members are strong against China, that disunity is something that's not good, and we have to codify and decide really what do we want when dealing with China, and by extension, what do we want when dealing with Taiwan.
Right.
So the other countries have those kinds of documents, really. A document dedicated to how they view China.
Yeah.
Recently, for example, the U.S. Categorically states that the U.S. is in competition with China, and that
I see.
it is a threat.
Okay.
Right. So that is a recognition of how the American government sees China.
Yeah.
It's something that we also have to.
Right. And it's
to-
more
to-
long term that way, because even
more
if you shift, if they shift the ruling party, that might be a little different. We might expect a change. But I think that's been a criticism or a quirk of Philippine politics, right? Like, the joke is every 6 years it might change. And we have seen China policy change from admin to admin. Obviously, most recently from the Duterte policy to the Marcos policy now. How do you do that though in a
Yeah,
Philippine
good
system that's
question.
so volatile or that's so prone to dramatic changes?
And that's why the bills in Congress legislating that we own certain territories, and that if someone gives it up,
Yeah.
there will be punitive mechanisms.
Okay.
That's how you safeguard
Yeah.
these territories.
I see.
Parang domestically, legally, it's in Philippine law
Right.
that
Right.
we own this.
Right.
And these are the limits of what you can do.
Right.
This is what you can do, so it enables you
Right.
to do certain things,
Right.
and disables you from doing certain things.
Yeah.
Once you have that in place, it doesn't matter,
I
right?
see.
And that could be an impeachable offense,
Right.
Because
Right.
that's treason. So,
Right. It's clear.
It's clear.
Para
So
klaro siya,
this is the map of the Philippines. This is what's ours. This is what's EEZ,
Yeah.
right? These islands are ours.
Yeah.
And therefore, if you sell that, or if you allow other countries to occupy that,
Right.
it's you can be punished by your own people.
Right. The Senate is tackling a baselines law, but I'm not sure if we're anywhere close to actually.
I think
Just leave it at that.
yes, Congress has
Yeah.
always been supportive of
Yeah.
that law.
Yeah.
Actually, and it's good that the Senate's moving
Yeah.
forward. I hope that in the next few years we're
Yeah.
able to pursue that and
Yeah.
implement that properly.
That should actually be sped up, no? Considering that the national security policy makes explicit that the threats are from outside, no longer from inside.
Correct, and that's
Yeah.
another thing.
Yeah.
That it's something naman we should celebrate with the national security policy, and the president that saying that the threat is external instead of internal.
Yeah.
Many security threats,
Yeah, yeah, of
really.
course. But the
Pero ngayon talagang
Priority.
external talaga.
Yeah. Yeah. So going back to Mao Ning's, the spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, her very very colorful way of responding to President Marcos's tweet. He basically told the president to read more. She did not specify on what he should be reading. And then she warned the Philippines against, quote, playing with fire on the question of Taiwan. For our viewers who are perhaps not as well versed in geopolitics, what does she mean when she says the question of Taiwan? What is the question that China is asking? What is the question that the Philippines is asking? Are we asking the same question here?
Maybe they're referring to the historical claims of
Yeah.
China with Taiwan. So, actually, China has not always been a communist country. Before 1949, before the Communist Party of China seized the political leadership of China, it was actually the Kuomintang who ruled China. So China for a time was a republican state, had a republican government after its dynastic system. And, unfortunately, that party lost, and that party who won, the Communist Party of China, ruled since then, and the losing party had to go to Taiwan, which was still part of China then. And maybe that's what they were referring to. But, it doesn't really excuse the fact that that Taiwan has its own system, has its own culture, has its own,
identity at this
political
point,
and economic destiny.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. This is probably like a question that's an obvious answer, but again, we ask the obvious questions because the answers might not be as obvious. When we speak of peace and stability in the South China Sea, you hear that a lot in the context, especially of ASEAN. ASEAN ministers will speak of a peaceful, a stable South China Sea, and let's extend that to the Taiwan Strait. When we say that it's important for those areas to be peaceful, to be stable, what is that speaking to? What is the point of keeping? What are we referring to, and what is our aspiration when we dream of peace and stability in those?
Well, number one is neighborly respect.
Yeah.
Really, and that's something that we haven't seen from China, right? They've been very disrespectful against Manila and the Philippines.
Yeah.
I mean, given that let's assume that the claims have not been settled.
Yes.
But if you're disputing, certain territories, you don't just occupy those islands.
You don't use lasers.
Right? You don't use lasers, you don't water cannon, you don't ram, you don't do
Yeah.
those disrespectful, condescending things towards the Philippines. So just be a good neighbor, right?
Yeah.
Number one.
Yeah.
I mean, there will be territorial disputes, but those aggressive and assertive things have no place, in the middle of adjudicating, who owns those islands, right? So, number one, that's really, China's been very, very disrespectful towards us. Number two, it's really, they always accuse the Philippines that we've started these things, but they're the first, country who forcibly, occupy those islands, and even create military installations.
Which makes it easy for them to stay in those waters all the time. Yeah.
Granted that Vietnam also has those installations and in the disputed islands, because Vietnam controls a big part of it. But the level of militarization that China has achieved in those islands is unprecedented. And that's why it makes the region unstable.
Yeah.
China should not militarize those islands. They always accuse the U.S. of meddling, but I think it's also their fault, because they've forced Southeast Asian countries to call on other external powers to stabilize the region and to create a balance of power, sort of, if you may, and make sure that peace and security is achieved in the region.
Another obvious issue here is also trade. Like, we've seen the German minister raise alarm over rough seas in the South China Sea, was her term. We have several non-traditional partners eager to forge defense ties with the Philippines. Canada wants a visiting forces agreement.
Yeah.
Japan is eyeing an RAA by the first quarter of the year. So that would be like between first announcing it, less than a year, magkakapirmahan na ng RAA. What trade implications, again, talking about peace and security, like, why is it important relative to trade?
To trade?
Yeah, in the South China Sea.
Uh, well, a huge part of global trade
Yeah.
is, happens in the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea, that area. Um, if China controls, and China uses economic leverage against enemies. In fact, it's done some
Taiwan,
embargoes
yeah.
in
Australia
Taiwan,
has been-
trade war with the U.S. So China could be very, very retaliatory.
Yeah.
And if it has de facto control of the trade routes,
Yeah.
and that will be dangerous for everyone, to
Yeah.
all countries involved,
That's
including
beyond the Indo-Pacific
the
now.
U.S. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a global issue.
Yeah.
I think it's not just an issue of the Philippines and
Right.
the claimant states. So the territorial disputes with China really has two aspects.
Yeah.
You have the aspect of the land, right, the territory, and you have
Yeah.
the aspect of the waters.
Yeah.
So I think those are two distinct
Yeah.
conflicts and disagreements. All of the external powers really care about the waterways. That's where
Yeah.
we have to maintain, especially international law, peace, security, because it will affect economic prosperity of everyone.
Talking about the distinction, just frankly, like if you're just a random person who drops by and reads about the West Philippine Sea, it might be a little tricky to understand yung separation ng ibang diskusyon yung lupa, ibang diskusyon yung tubig. And I recall this conversation among foreign affairs reporters and certain security officials of the Philippines and even diplomats actually. So, nagkaroon ng bilateral consultation mechanism in Shanghai yesterday.
Yeah.
Both China and the Philippines spoke about it today. The DFA said that the two countries had a frank and productive discussion to de-escalate the situation in South China Sea. But my question is, how can you tangibly de-escalate the situation when, one, you have Beijing insisting that we are linked by a strip of water. Of course, it's a reference to the 10-dash line, na malapit lang daw tayo. And then, again, like you said, when Beijing talks about ayungin, they talk about the land, the supposed land. That's their territory. When we talk about ayungin, we talk about the fact that it's within our EEZ. We talk about the waters. We talk about sovereign rights. So how do you agree when on that very basic principle, kumbaga you're arguing from very different perspectives?
Yeah, yun nga. Actually, that's why it's very difficult then to go to the negotiating table and just settle these disputes, because one, you're applying very different principles and very different. You're coming from two different perspectives, and the perspective of China is that the 200 nautical mile rule that was created a couple of decades ago does not really apply to them because of some historical.
Agreed to it.
Sorry?
But they agreed to it anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, but they can change. And under Xi Jinping, they've changed quite dramatically. But it's really that we're talking past each other. They're talking at us. They're not talking, properly to resolve. They really want to get their way.
Yeah.
And I think that's the problem, really. That China is hard-headed. That it doesn't want to compromise. Even if before it has compromised, in fairness, it has compromised some territorial disputes peacefully.
Yeah.
But the period after Xi Jinping became the president of China is a totally different China. It's a totally different period.
Yeah.
And it's become more hard-headed. It's become more assertive.
They perceive themselves differently. They see their role in the world differently this time.
Very, very differently. It has that vengeance, right? Towards the China dream. So it has that aspiration, a revivalist aspiration in today's world.
Yeah. So how do you? Well, that's the problem of the DFA, frankly. But like, how do you even? What is there a way to bring tensions down? Because they were like, to end 2023, you had back-to-back water cannoning incidents in Scarborough and Ayungin. Before that, there were collisions and near collisions. February 2023, almost a year ago now, they used a military-grade laser against the Philippines. So
and some acoustic devices, no, against
they,
Coast
yeah,
Guard.
yeah. So how do you figure that out when they're, and also connected to that, parang the observation is either they're only doing this to the Philippines, or they're doing this to other countries, but they're not. Those countries aren't transparent about China's actions in the waters in their EEZ.
China is also aggressive towards Taiwan, although in a
Yeah.
different way. You know, it's more. It uses more the air. It's not maritime as much as it is towards the Philippines. I'm not sure about Vietnam, although
Yeah.
I know that Vietnam and China has very violent history leading to the deaths of some people. Before. No?
Yeah.
And so I think it's a common experience among all the claimant states, no? But especially the Philippines.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Philippines is a special case because we are a treaty ally of the United States. Taiwan is sort of has that very close but informal partnership with the United States as well.
Yeah.
And we are therefore an object of more aggression and more assertiveness from China.
Yeah, I recall that you wrote about this with last year, late last year was it? Warning
Yes.
Taiwan that what's happening to the Philippines
Might be what's happening to the Philippines and South China Sea might also be the strategy that China will use towards Taiwan.
Right.
And although, Taiwan is a different case, but China may use the same strategy of gray zone tactics,
Right.
Chinese militia, really assertive and aggressive actions.
Is there a world in which it's possible for China, maybe not to change its position, I think that's asking for the moon, but softening with regards to the Philippines, with regards to Taiwan?
That's an interesting conversation. Yeah, if there were hopes that China will democratize, there's that whole conversation among scholars and China observers that China will be democratic. And let me tell you, what underpins China's belligerence and aggressiveness and ambition is the Communist Party.
Yeah.
And the reason why the Communist Party, many reasons why the Communist Party has succeeded so far, in the staying power rather of the Communist Party has been quite long. It's because of output legitimacy. That means that it's legitimate. The Chinese people support the party because of economic outputs and material outputs. And therefore, the Chinese people are willing to relegate some of their rights to the state in exchange for economic and material prosperity.
But that's changing.
But that's changing.
Yeah.
And so the conversation about the strength of the party is now again an issue, whether the Chinese Communist Party will actually be able to sustain its power.
Right.
If it breaks down, and that's why domestic politics is important. We have to understand
It
what's
can't
happening
be just a vacuum,
in
no?
Taiwan.
Yeah,
we
yeah,
have
yeah.
to understand what's happening inside China. And so if the power of the Communist Party erodes, there's a big possibility that China will change its position towards many issues. And I think that large-scale social change within China will have a big effect on the region and the world.
Right.
So scholars are saying that
Yeah.
we should just socialize China into the world.
Right.
But some people are saying, no, we really have to inject democratic values. So it's an ongoing debate, really how to achieve that
Right.
change within China.
Right. Going back to bilateral relations between China and the Philippines, to cap off this conversation, actually, let's listen to Chinese Ambassador Wang Xilian live. Na joke lang. His remarks last night, January 17, this was during a Chinese embassy hosted event held in the Philippines. Here in this clip, he is talking about diplomatic ties of China and the Philippines. Let's hear that clip.
What I want to emphasize is that Taiwan question is China's internal affairs and lies at the core of China's core interests with extremely high sensitivity. So the One China policy is the political premise on which China established and developed diplomatic relations with the Philippines. So we should strengthen instead of shape such foundation. Next.
So, you have the ambassador of China to Manila, basically talking about the importance, one, of the One China policy and of bilateral discussions and of Manila not meddling what they consider to be a domestic issue. Siguro yung pinaka-last kong tanong would be what a lot of people, again, who might be just casual readers or observers of foreign policy be, they might ask, what role does diplomacy, diplomatic talks, diplomatic discussions? Again, nagkaroon ng bilateral meeting between Xi Jinping and Marcos in San Francisco. But then after that, you had water cannoning incidents in the West Philippine Sea. And then there were phone calls between Foreign Minister Wang Yi, Secretary Enrique Manalo before the year ended. The BCM in Shanghai happened just a day ago. But I guess if you think about it, in the real world, you'll talk to fisher folk who will say, hindi pa rin kami makapasok sa Scarborough Shoal. You talk to the Philippine Coast Guard, they'll say, hinaharas pa rin kami sa West Philippine Sea. So parang given the reality on the ground, that tila nothing changes, what is the value of diplomatic conversations?
We should not expect changes in the next few years from China. I think that's something that I would unfortunately have to say. But it doesn't mean that diplomacy does not have any value. No one wants a war to break out.
Right.
The fact that two countries are still having conversations and discussions is a good thing, because that means that there's the possibility of resolution.
Yeah.
Right. Even if there's not actual resolution, there's a possibility of resolution.
Yeah.
And to basically delay
Yeah.
a probability that an
Escalation.
actual war will occur. And that's why the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea international relations should be an election issue, but it is not, because you can't even think about economic growth and development and poverty alleviation if there's an imminent threat on everyone, regardless of whether you're rich or poor. Right? So international relations and foreign policy is of primordial importance.
Right.
And diplomacy is still the way to go. We don't want war. Our diplomats are, fortunately very able. But perhaps the goal right now is to manage the tensions and keep the peace. But at the same time, balance the interests of the Philippines, which is that to protect national sovereignty.
That was a very sobering, hopeful but sobering note. Thank you again, Robin, for your time. I know you're a very busy man. Thank you for explaining the Taiwan question, and perhaps better explaining in better than we would of why Taiwan matters to the average Filipino. Now, thank you for watching. We can continue this conversation in the Rappler community chats. Just download the app. You can sign up. Head on over to community chats, the community chats tab, and then you can talk about Taiwan relations and the Taiwan situation there. As in, do you agree with President Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s decision to congratulate the President-elect of Taiwan? Or do you disagree? You can voice out there. Again, this has been Beko Pin. Thank you for watching. Bye.